In the world of gaming, we are always wishing and hoping for new, fresh, creative ideas, for new games to come around and fresh new experiences that show us that we want new games and not just the same thing over and over again with little to no differences. Pfft, who am I kidding? That's the thing that gamers like to say. But in reality, we all want them long-awaited sequels. We want games from a franchise long thought dead to come back and hopefully revitalise it back into the spotlight. And I would be lying if I said I wasn't that myself. Every time I sit through a Nintendo Direct or a Summer Game Fest or back in the day E3, looking at all the amazing new games thinking, wow, these look great. But then losing my mind at them revealing a new Pokemon game or a brand new Zelda game, like, oh my god, they're making a new Zelda game! Like, a game that is in a majorly successful franchise. Oh my god, this is so surprising! But unfortunately, not all gaming franchises are so lucky. Even if the franchise itself is really good, there are so many factors into why not a game gets made. Look at Pokemon. Game 3 have essentially been releasing half-baked, bug-ridden messes for the past 5 years, and yep, they still sell like crazy, even with the lowest scores in the franchise history. So that's why there are so many highly consistent gaming franchises out there that just can't get a new game. And today, I want to go through game franchises that I would like to return. This one might be considered cheating because, if truth be told, Ni no Kuni isn't really what you would call a franchise, and it wasn't even that long ago they released a game, but that was a mobile game and doesn't really count in my eyes. And the series has at least 2 games, so I'm going to count it. But if you haven't heard of these games before, they are beautiful, anime-esque, Studio Ghibli-inspired JRPGs with a mixture of turn-based and real-time combat with heartwarming stories and beautiful music. And being a big anime fan myself, the games just connected with me, and I love them both so much. The first and second game, although similar in looks, actually play quite different from one another. The first game is more of a turn-based JRPG, where you can wander around the battlefield controlling your Pokemon-esque creatures called familiars, whereas the second game is more of an action-based combat system. It's not exactly Devil May Cry, but it gets the job done, and it's pretty enjoyable. I know the consensus is that most enjoy the first game's combat more, but honestly, I like both, and I think they both have merit. But one thing that the games do have in common, other than the beautiful world, music, and stories, is the fact that they both have a young teenage male protagonist who sound like they're 5 years old.
I'm Evan Petty Whisker Tildrum, King of Ding Dong Dell!
Yeah, I'm not buying it. But since Ni no Kuni 2 was released in 2018 and we got all the DLCs for it, we have not had a new entry in the franchise, like I said, before we had a mobile game release in 2021. But at the time of this video, there is no sign of a Ni no Kuni 3, which is disheartening as the franchise itself has so much potential. If we were to get a Ni no Kuni 3, honestly, there's not a lot I would change to the formula. Perhaps having an older protagonist would be a good change, as even though I don't have a problem with Oliver and Evan, it would be interesting to see what they would do with it. Perhaps make the tone of the story a bit darker, but keep the beautiful art style, incredible music, and either combat style, and I'm happy. The 90s were filled with 3D platforming mascots aplenty. Mario, Banjo, Crash, Gex. You literally could not avoid them, and no doubt if you're of a certain age, you will have played at least one of their games. But there's one major one that I'm missing, that is beloved by people even to this day, and of course, that can only be Bubsy. Yeah, I'm joking, of course, it was Spyro. But technically speaking, I was born in 2000, so I never really got to experience Spyro in his heyday. But I did grow up with Spyro Enter the Dragonfly. Wow! Yeah, the game's not great, but as a child I loved it, and it was one of my favourite games, and turned me into a fan of the franchise. I even loved the Legends games, so imagine my reaction when I played the Reignited trilogy, and I just fell in love with the franchise all over again. But since the release of the Reignited trilogy, nearly 6 years ago, we have had nothing. We just all assumed since Crash finally got his new game after a remastered trilogy, we would be getting the same with Spyro. But no, as of 2024, we have no clear future for Spyro, as a franchise with it being even more uncertain, as recently the studio behind the Reignited trilogy, Toys for Bob, went independent from Activision and are going off to do their own thing that's not Spyro. So what studio would even make Spyro for? Who knows, but I'm not losing hope completely. Spyro did survive after turning into this thing, so I think there's a chance he can come back fighting. If Spyro 4 was to be a thing, I think needs to have some pretty big changes, but also would need to keep it faithful to the original. The biggest change I would make is making it open world or open zoned. Now, some people might think I'm crazy for suggesting that, but let me explain. A 3D platformer's bread and butter are how you move and how you control. You don't have both of them, then you're doing something wrong. Luckily, Spyro has both of these, but I think his movement potential is restricted to the smallish levels of the original trilogy. If we had a new game with a much bigger open zones where we could upgrade not only Spyro's combat abilities, but his movement abilities as well, I just think that would be a whole lot of fun. Now for me, there's been one franchise that I want back more than any other that's been dormant for far too long. Every time Ubisoft announces a new game, there's always a part of me that's hoping that it's a new game in this franchise, before ultimately revealing Assassin's Creed 15 even greedier. This franchise was a staple of my childhood, and was my true introduction into amazing 3D platformers, and that of course is Rayman. Somehow haven't heard of Rayman. He was somewhat of an unofficial mascot for Ubisoft in the late 90s, early 2000s. He was a 2D turned 3D platformer that really left his mark on the industry, with Rayman 2 being lauded as one of the best 3D platformers of all time. And this franchise left a big impact on me because of its fun gameplay, slapstick humour, and mainly just because it was really weird and creepy. Seriously, the tone and atmosphere of Rayman 2 and 3 can be very unsettling and sometimes a little scary, and you know what? I absolutely love it. Where pretty much all 3D platformers go for the kid-friendly aesthetics, Rayman isn't afraid to go dark, and I love it. Unfortunately, Rayman's 3D life was cut short due to an epidemic, unfortunately known as the Rabbids. And he hasn't had a true 3D game in over 20 years, which is criminal really. There's so much potential for another Rayman game, but unfortunately it's currently in Ubisoft's tight grips, and who knows if they're willing to let it go. Now, that's not saying Rayman's been completely absent for over 20 years. He's received two excellent 2D platformers in the early 2010s, who made an appearance in the DLC of the new Rabbids game, but I want him back as a 3D platformer. If we were to get a Rayman 4, I don't care if it's open world, level based, open zoned, whatever. I just want it to be as weird and creepy as possible. I want the characters like Glowbox and the Teensies to be weird as possible, and I want the atmosphere and the world to be creepy and as weird as possible. Because I believe that's what Rayman thrives on, and we deserve him back.